Hello and welcome to Global Chit Chat, our weekly show where we analyze the biggest developments across the globe over the last 7 days with our guest and expert, Tridivesh Singh Maini. Thanks, sir, very much for being here as always.
Happy.
Sir, in keeping with the big developments in the Middle East and in South Asia, we'll keep our focus there first about the Afghanistan situation. We've talked about how the United States has responded. We've seen Russia and China take their stand. What do you think the Gulf countries can do in this situation to diffuse the tension? What role can they play?
Okay. So as you would be familiar that, the Taliban, it set up its first sort of overseas office in Doha, in Qatar, in 2013. And even if you look at the talks which have been going on between the US and the sort of the Taliban, it is Qatar which has played a very important role. I mean, if you look at the Seoul Agreement also, which in February 2020, I think Qatar has actually played quite an important role in that. And so the role is obviously not just symbolic, the fact that the Taliban, that there were back channel negotiations there or whatever, but even otherwise, they have managed to build reasonable links with the Taliban. And so in that sense, Qatar's role will be important. And also, if you look at the evacuation, Qatar has also helped in the evacuation of not just on the one hand, obviously there were Afghans, who wanted to leave, but even of other countries, they were temporarily evacuated to Qatar. Similarly, if you look at UAE, a lot of people who wanted to go to third countries were first evacuated to the UAE, and then they went ahead. So in this whole discussion about the US or about Russia or about China, we are probably missing out. And obviously, if you look at the OIC also has an important role, and OIC has already actually issued a statement that again, that it would want that there's peace, there's security, right? So that also sends out a message to the Taliban, right? Now the question is that what role? I mean, if you look at it, I think apart from obviously their links, the links which countries like Qatar have established, and probably even some of the other GCC countries, they are also important. The GCC countries are important intermediaries for one, obviously, for the US, and even for other countries which have close ties with the US, but are not very comfortable with the rise of the Taliban. GCC countries can play an extremely important role in that. So I think this is, as it is, if you've been noticing that over the past few years, a number of GCC countries have been, you can say that they've been punching beyond their weight diplomatically. But now, obviously, they have immense importance. And it's no longer just Saudi Arabia. I mean, earlier it used to be Saudi Arabia. Now you have, as I said, Qatar, you have UAE, right? That's one part. The other interesting thing is that, Qatar has also, in a way, outmaneuvered the other countries in this context. In fact, in 2017, a number of Arab states, including GCC states, snapped diplomatic ties also with Qatar because of their links with the Taliban. So this has created some problems also if you look at it in the context of the GCC states itself.
Right. So next, I'd like to shift our attention a little bit to Gulf and Israel. What's happening there? What do you think the developments have been 1 year on of the Abraham Accords?
Okay, so that's very important. So again, a lot of events have got overshadowed by what is happening in Afghanistan, but this is very important. I mean, the Abraham Accords were important in the context of normalization of ties between the UAE and Bahrain with Israel, and you had other states also. You had two non-GCC states also, Sudan and Morocco, which are part of the Abraham Accords. Now, on the one hand, you have this whole thing about the symbolic importance of the accords. If you look, for instance, at diplomatic relations, setting up of consulates. If you look at the UN, Israel, they've already done that. Embassies in each other's countries, that has come up. Economic ties between UAE and Israel have witnessed a significant rise. A number of companies from the UAE have already like some funds from the UAE have put their money, infrastructure funds and all, have committed that they're going to invest in Israel. And if you even, I think the upcoming expo, in that also Israeli companies will probably, the UAE-Israel relationship, economic relationship will be basically one of the important highlights. And obviously, the UAE is attractive because of its geographical location. And even at the level of soft power, the number of tourists actually now going, there's been a rise. A large number of Israeli tourists are actually going to the UAE. So that's one part of it. Bahrain also, though of course, as yet the results of that, the Abraham Accords in terms of the economic relationship have not shown up to that degree. Now, the most important, as I said, when you talk of GCC, you talk of Saudi Arabia. Now, interestingly, Saudi Arabia and Israel, the relations have been improving even before the Abraham Accords, and that was one of the main changes within the Middle East, that the GCC ties with Israel were improving, and that actually suited the US, right? Given the fact that both, on the one hand, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and all are close to the US, and even Israel, obviously, as we all know, in terms of the strategic relationship and everything. So that was beneficial. And it was a Trump administration which was at the forefront of that. But Saudi Arabia has added a note of caution recently that, being part of the Abraham Accords may not be easy until there is a resolution to the Palestinian-Israel conflict. So that's something which you need to bear in mind. So they've, sort of cautioned those saying that, Saudi Arabia is also going to be part of that. The Saudi foreign minister recently said this earlier this month that it's not possible without a resolution. Not directly, but he alluded to that. Now, this is one part. This is about the relationship between GCC and Israel. What we have also noticed over the last year, not directly related to the Abraham Accords, but because of the Biden administration's changes, their Middle Eastern policy significantly, changed in terms, if you compare it to the Trump administration, at least to begin with. Now it's, if you look at the handling of JCPOA, it's becoming very similar to the Trump administration. But to begin with, it was trying to equalize. So obviously, as we know that the Trump administration, people would say that basically Israel and Saudi Arabia had a veto over the Middle East policy, right? Because if you look at the Trump administration's approach towards Iran, that's the way it was. But Biden has been very, to begin with, there was a focus on, sorting out ties with Iran, getting back onto the JCPOA because of some pressure that has not happened. But what that did was that compelled Saudi Arabia and UAE and other GCC countries to look at improving their ties with Iran as well. So there's been again, in the last few weeks after the attack on this oil tanker, of Oman, again, Saudi Arabia has been critical of Iran, but in between, Saudi Arabia had actually made a lot of overtures to Iran, and that again was beneficial for the US and for getting back onto the JCPOA. That's changed for the time being, but I think apart from the Abraham Accords you're looking at, 1 year down the line, that is basically major change. The GCC countries themselves are wanting to improve their ties with Iran. And this is not dependent, this has not been supported only, it's not because of the US, it's because they are seeing the changing geopolitical winds, within the Middle East, and they made that change. So I think now, if you look at just briefly, if you look at this whole thing out of Afghanistan, it's going to be interesting to see because obviously as the GCC countries also have the clout. Iran has, because of geography, it has more clout, it has more linkages and everything actually, and it's impacted by the relation. Is that also going to create some sort of, rivalry? Because a country like India, for India, both Qatar obviously is going to be important, and even Iran will be important because Iran has spoken for a greater role, for India and Afghanistan. So this is something which we need to keep a close watch on.
So like you said, geopolitical winds are changing. And in another development, the Japanese foreign minister is visiting the Middle East. A couple of nations visited Iran after meeting officials in Israel. So what do you think is happening there? What's the relevance of this, considering Afghanistan situation? Everybody wants to stabilize it.
Right. So the first thing is that, by with the Japanese foreign minister going there, the attention is also back on the Iran nuclear deal, which has slowed down. The progress in terms of the Iran nuclear deal is slow of late. And as we had discussed in earlier shows, there was an apprehension that what would, the new Iranian president's approach be towards the deal. He'll be a tougher negotiator than his predecessor. So I think his conversation with the French president and now his meeting with the Japanese foreign minister would have allayed some fears, and obviously Japan and France would have indirectly, I mean, there must be some, messages from Washington as well. It cannot only, I mean, obviously there's an independent thing, the relationships are sui generis, but there is a US angle to it in terms of the JCPOA. So the first thing which you need to look at is with all the attention focused on Afghanistan, at least some attention has also got back to the Iran nuclear deal, which is very important. So that's one thing. And I think while on the one hand, this is important because what has happened after Afghanistan. On the one hand, US has given very wrong signaling to some of its allies as well. So just to deviate a bit, for instance, during Kamala Harris's visit to Southeast Asia, if you notice, Vietnam is also balancing out with China. So during this visit, during the course of a visit to Southeast Asia, you also had a high-level Chinese delegation there, going there, and Vietnam saying that we want to balance out relations. So while on the one hand, that signaling is there, but in the context of Iran, I think the Biden administration would do well to work closely with the allies and also to pay heed to what they say. That, because a lot of countries are close to the US actually want the revival of the JCPOA, both for economic and strategic reasons. They want the revival of the JCPOA. So I think basically the US, the lesson, from Afghanistan, as I'm saying, is that on the Iran issue, they should not just use the allies, to convey messages, but also listen to what they have to actually say in terms of, showing a bit more, because a lot of US allies have actually been urging the Biden administration to be more flexible, because obviously they have their own interests in a better relationship with Iran. So that's one part of it. The second is, apart from their own relations with Iran, they also realize that, Iran is important in the context of Afghanistan. So now, again, one doesn't know what happens in diplomacy in the back channels and all, whether the US itself has opened this back channel, not just for the JCPOA, but to make use of Iran as an intermediary, or whether these countries are also looking at it, in the context, obviously, and everybody wants to enhance their own diplomatic clout. So, Japan or France, they will, as I said, we discussed earlier, there'll be more convergences than divergences with the US, but it doesn't have to be absolute convergence. There can be certain areas where there may be divergences, even in the approach, there could be differences. And similarly, vis-a-vis Iran, even if you look at the pandemic, for instance, Japan's approach, while even during the Trump administration, Japan and US had a very close relationship, but Japan was one country which kept on urging the Trump administration to, take a relook at its Iran policy. For instance, during the midst of the coronavirus, right from the onset of the pandemic, Japan had actually urged the Trump administration to relax sanctions. And Japan has also provided a lot of assistance to Iran. Recently, also, in fact, it's provided vaccine doses to Iran. And earlier also, at the beginning of the pandemic, relief materials and everything. And Japan has been one country, apart from, the E3 countries, Japan has been very proactive in urging the Trump administration that they need to take a sort of relook. And what we could also see is that, again, a slight deviation. We are looking at just primarily these days, the focus again, on gender in IR is always on the Great Powers. If you notice, Japan is playing a very important role. So again, it wants to not just be viewed as a US ally or somebody who wants to take China on, but also that it has its own independent foreign policy. Similarly, if you look at in East Asia, Japan's neighbor, South Korea, they also if on the Afghanistan issue, they're trying to take an independent stance, and in fact, if I'm not mistaken, some Afghans, a large number of Afghans actually, who were working with South Korea or with South Korean, like with the embassy over there and things like that, they are actually being provided relief in South Korea. So normally you always assume that Western countries will be doing this, but there's a change. So even in East Asia, you're seeing that countries are trying to define themselves close to the US, but have an independent sort of foreign policy as well. So I think it's important in that context. But I think the final thing is that a lot will now depend upon how much time the US is able to give to the Iran nuclear deal, given its other challenges in Afghanistan. So that is the most important.
Thanks again, sir, as always, for breaking down these complex geopolitics taking shape. And I thank our viewers for joining in. Stay tuned for Global Chit Chat next week.